Did Islam today replace Marxism in the front line of the battle against imperialism, especially American imperialism?
Islam is not a monolithic religion. It is very large. It is different in different parts of the world. So in the first place, we can't talk about Islam as a uniform thing. Islam in Senegal and Mali is very different from Islam in Bosnia. In Bosnia, Islam is very different from what it is in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabian Islam is different from Egyptian Islam. But what is true is that in the Middle East countries, the collapse of Arab nationalism, the collapse of the left, largely because it was defeated by Israel in wars instigated by the West, has left a big vacuum. And in this vacuum are stepping in organized Islamist parties. And these Islamist parties are the same parties who, during the peak of Arab nationalism, collaborated with the United States. So they do what they think is in their interest. When they want to collaborate, they collaborate. When they want to fight, fight. They're very similar to the Americans themselves. The Americans, throughout the Cold War, were using Islam as a pillar against communism. In Indonesia, in Pakistan, in the Middle East, everywhere. They used these guys to defeat the Russians in Afghanistan. And these same guys who helped them defeat the Russians are now their biggest enemies. So we live in a world without any meaningful norms or principles. It is imperial interests that determine, and the Islamist parties have become their mirror image. In some cases, they're very open about it. If you look at the Turkish government today, the government of Erdogan, it is an Islamist government, totally committed to the United States. They are NATO's favorite Islamists. And they want now to spread that example to Egypt and maybe soon to Syria. This is the model which you should follow.
You said several times that it's a shame that former Yugoslavia fell apart. And I remember that you called the new countries of former Yugoslavia protectorates. In one interview to Global Balkan Network, you said that an intelligent leadership of the European Union should attempt in the future to put Yugoslavia back together as a federation within the European Union. Are you still of that opinion?
I am, and I think, the breakup of Yugoslavia was a tragedy for everyone. It's not that I support one side against the other. It was a huge tragedy for all the peoples. Not just ethnic people, but people who had intermarried. I had large numbers of Yugoslav friends. Serbs married to Croats, Croats married to Slovenians, Bosniaks married to everybody. It was like that. No one in the 70s and 80s even used to think about these terms, and then suddenly these huge nationalisms erupt. And you have to ask yourself, why? And one reason is that the world is changing, but another reason is that the IMF and the demands it put on the Yugoslav Federation of structural reforms was horrific, absolutely horrific, that the Yugoslav army could not be paid for one whole year. Salaries couldn't be paid because they were following the IMF reforms. So those economics helped in the disintegration of the former Yugoslavia. And then you had narrow nationalist elites. They said, well, why should the central elite be dealing with all this? We can make money ourselves. And so they wanted to mimic the central elite, and the responsibility, I think, of Milosevic in this is great. He wasn't alone, but he could have played a different role, as some people at that time from Serbia and from Croatia and from Slovenia were telling him to do. But the big sort of nationalist pull was the only way they thought, this political layer, that they could stay in power. Now, at that time, if the Germans and the British and the French and the European Union had said to all the different leaders of the Yugoslav states, said, look, we know there's trouble. We don't want you to fight each other. This is going to be a European disaster. We are prepared to offer you $2 billion in aid for big infrastructural projects, and you stay together more loosely than before, in a different way, but we don't want you to. Instead, what did they do? They saw the collapse of the Soviet Union, and they said, maybe this is now our chance. And I blame the Germans in particular on this. This wasn't an American plot, as some people think. This was essentially a European Union disaster, that the Germans thought, this is now our chance to sort of flex our muscles as a European power. And the first thing you saw happening was Slovenia going. And then there's absolutely no doubt that the Germans pushed for Croatian independence. It's not a secret anymore. And that then created nationalism that exacerbated nationalism from the other side, and you had this horrific civil war. Okay, it's happened. We cannot rebuild that model again. But you have people in all the former constituent republics, the new generations, who speak the same language, who are next to each other, who can live in a different way. They can preserve their states, loosely, but they can build a regional confederation, and I would argue not just the former Yugoslavia, but Bulgaria and Greece as well. A Balkan confederation which collaborates with each other, which works with each other, which is in the European Union, which will have to be reformed anyway, in my opinion, and which acts as a unit to defend the collective interests of the region. I believe that can be done.
You believe that the nationalism that is very strong currently in the Balkan, you also said that yourself, could be overcome to build
in this fashion
something.
It could be overcome, I think, because it's in the interest of the ordinary people. Look, I'm a writer. If I was just speaking in my own interest, I would say to you, it's very nice for me to come to the former Yugoslavia and have the same books I write published in the same language 4 different times. I get 4 different sets of royalties.
Yes.
But it makes me very sad, really. And when I was in Sarajevo a few years ago at the book fair, I said before the book fair, I said to my publishers in Bosnia and Serbia, I said, one of you have already translated some books which the other hasn't. Collaborate, give each other and they did it. And, I was very happy with that. And the book is now being translated here, and they have used the Serbian translation, which is wonderful. But it also begs a few other questions. It can be done on every level, really. And what are these countries? Are they really independent? I don't think so. I think they are protectorates. Kosovo is a total protectorate. Bosnia is a protectorate. Serbia and Croatia are going to become EU colonies. And as for Montenegro, it is also a protectorate, but we're not sure whose protectorate it is. Mm-hmm. We can guess.
We can guess. Another thing that you said, and I thought was very, very interesting, I loved the definition that you gave, was that the Balkan War transformed journalism. That before the Balkans, journalists didn't accept official versions of governments. They went, they investigated, they wanted to get to the bottom of things. And that since the Balkan Wars, journalism turned into, and this was a term that I loved, a news-gathering operation. Now, why is that, in your opinion? Did journalists become lazy? Is it a question of technology? Is it a question of money? What happened?
I think what happened to journalism is that it's a deeper problem. That throughout the Cold War years, let's say from 1917-18 to 1990, 70 years or so, the key aim of the West and the key propaganda of the West to the Soviet Union and the Eastern countries was, we have democracy and you don't, which was true. We have a press which is very diverse. You can read many criticisms of our leaders in it. They criticize our wars when we fight wars. Do your people criticize wars when you invade Hungary or Czechoslovakia? No, but our people can do it. Once the Soviet Union collapsed, the West saw no need to keep a diverse media. The reason for that was over and finished, and so the media became a pillar of the state. Ironically, and often when you read most papers in the West, not all, some are still publishing critical remarks, but most papers, when wars break out which their governments support, they back them. They just back them because they are very dependent now on the states, and also when the state goes to war, when imperialism decides to conquer a country and occupy it, they now also say to journalists, if you want to save your lives, you have to come with us, stay with our army, become embedded journalists, and if you don't, we're not responsible for you. So there's also a threat. And so people see what they want to see, but many journalists say, oh, why bother? We're on the right side now. Our side is right. We're always right. The enemy is changed. Islam is an evil civilization. They genuinely believe that, many of them. There's some footage after the fall of Baghdad, Western journalists watching this event from Qatar next door. And the news comes, the Baghdad has fallen, and they all stand up and start clapping. These are Western journalists covering the Iraq war. So when I hear talks about the Western press these days being totally free, it's nonsense, it isn't. If you look at Rupert Murdoch, the biggest global owner of the media, who is now in trouble, which makes me very happy. But during the Iraq war, all his newspapers on 4 different continents supported that war. So what is freedom of the press?